and welcome to this very special episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener, and not Gareth Tennant, but with a guest who's frankly, don't listen to this, Gareth, much better
posing as Gareth. Yeah.
Well, you do a much better job of posing than Gareth, and you're far better looking. Gareth can't punch me right now because he's away, but that's what we'll do. In this podcast, as you know, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamworks, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion usually between a former Royal Marines officer and now a book author, expert, and someone who can tell some really interesting stories, and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And the reason why you can hear a slightly excited tone in my voice today is because this is one of our influencers episodes. And for those of you who have listened to our previous influencers episode, which has ranged remarkably from Dolly Parton all the way through to Erwin Rommel and everything in between, usually myself or Gareth go away and become very, very amateur historians, and we try to collect the story in as much detail as we can. But I am always extraordinarily nervous that if there are any experts listening, they will realize that we're making most of this stuff up, in the sense that we're very amateurs. Today, we are very, very lucky to have a genuine expert to talk about one of our influencers. And what's more, the influencer is someone, it is a story which I've read about and heard about recently, which I think fits perfectly into our influencer world. So without further ado, Claire Mulley, welcome very, very much to the podcast.
Hello, very nice to be here. Thank you.
She says that she hasn't heard how this goes for the next hour or so, but we'll do that. Claire, I'll briefly introduce you to those who may or may not be familiar with you. But Claire Mulley is an award-winning public historian, trustee of a national charity standing together against domestic violence, as well as being an author and broadcaster who's primarily focused on the experiences of women in the Second World War. And I thought the first time I came across Claire was as part of the WWII Festival, and also as part of that podcast, which people listen know we're great fans of. But actually, my first encounter was through your book, Women Who Flew for Hitler. So you actually have a huge number of people who we can talk about in terms of influencers, but that's for another episode. Claire's most recent book, and actually what we're going to talk about today, is called Agent Zoe, the Untold Story of a Fearless Second World War Resistance Fighter. And I'm going to get this wrong, even though you told me how to get this right just only a few minutes ago. Elżbieta Zawacka, was that close?
Elżbieta Zawacka.
See, I always get this wrong. I'm going to do this until I get this right. Elżbieta Zawacka.
Yeah, the W is like a V sound. Yeah, Zawacka.
I may cheat through this and say Zoe, so I don't insult her memory, and I'll let you use the name as you go.
As soon as I knew her code name was Zoe, I knew we had a title. Yeah, that's nice and easy.
So we're going to talk about Elżbieta today as our influencer. Hopefully this is an interesting conversation for everyone who's listening. It's an amazing story. And as I was reading the book, and I often read the book at night after work, and we're sitting in bed, and I kept turning to my wife and saying, you're not going to believe what she did next. You're not going to believe. So we'll hear the exciting story. But obviously part of this is it's really interesting to try and understand as much as we can. And I think we're quite far away from this, people's motivations, how they think about some of these things, and any sort of broader lessons we can learn. So I had a much longer explanation of what Claire's done in terms of all the other books she's written, where she's published, and she said, let's just get on with it, Chris. So I'm going to do that.
Could I just mention, though, that although you cut down, actually, I'm no longer a trustee of Standing Together Against Domestic Violence. That is something I did, but some time ago now. So just for accuracy, just to mention.
We like accuracy. And the reason why so technically that's not normally in your bio. And the reason why I brought that in was because, and this is something that we probably will touch upon in this episode, is your focus on women and women in the military. And I don't know whether this is the right term, women's rights. But that's something which actually, certainly in the last few episodes of Battling with Business, we've touched on. So but perhaps that's something that we'll touch on a little bit later. Anyway, the last thing I have to say that I know is on your bio is that I believe you are a dog lover. Is that correct?
I have got a sickly dog with me today. So, yeah.
Oh, so both myself and Gareth are dog lovers, and at various times in the podcast, you can hear dogs either snoring or barking in the background. So
Well,
if you
or
do need to
farting
stop,
in my case, my dog's case, that
then
is.
you are all right by us. You are a dog lover like us. So we are extraordinarily lucky to have you on the podcast. Thank you very much, Claire, for coming. So let's jump straight into the story, and let's maybe start at the beginning. We're going to talk about Agent Zoe. See what I did there to avoid having to say her name incorrectly again. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how you first came across her, given the line of work you're in.
Sure, absolutely. I suppose the first thing to say is roughly who she is, so people know what we're talking about. And Zoe was the only woman to parachute from Britain to Nazi German occupied Poland during the Second World War. We shouldn't phase her because she'd already served 3 years in the resistance behind enemy lines in Poland. And she's actually the only woman also to serve as an emissary of the Allied Home Army to make it all the way from Warsaw across nearly 1,000 miles of enemy occupied territory to Britain, where she undertook 2 missions, did a bit more training, i.e. parachuting, and trained some of the guys out there in Britain, and then became the only woman to parachute back, where while she was hunted by the Gestapo, who arrested her entire family, she took part in the largest organised act of resistance against occupation in Europe, and she kept on fighting after that. She's an absolutely extraordinary figure. And how did I first come across her? Well, to my shame, I'd never heard of her. And I'd written a couple of previous books. You mentioned The Women Who Flew for Hitler, which was the book before this one. And the book before that was called The Spy Who Loved, which was my second book. And that was about a woman called Christina Skarbek, better known in this country, slightly better known as Christine Granville. And she was the first woman to serve Britain as a special agent directly. And in fact, our longest serving agent, male or female, and one of the most effective during the Second World War. And she was Polish born, although she became a British citizen. And the Poles were delighted that someone had picked up this story and was telling it. This history really matters to me. So I managed to get a bronze bust of her commissioned in London. I managed to get English Heritage gave a blue plaque, one of their round blue plaques on the side of a building. And I've got her in the National Portrait Gallery and so on. So I've tried to really put her back into the national story where she so clearly belongs. And the Polish government were pleased, and they very, very kindly gave me the Bene Merito, which is it's a medal. It's a cultural honorarium, cultural award. So I was absolutely thrilled. Wear it whenever I get the chance, which is not particularly often. But anyhow, very, very proud to have that. And I went to the Polish embassy to receive it. It was given to me by Radek Sikorski, who was then the foreign minister and is now again the foreign minister of Poland. And there were a few of us getting honours that day. There was a couple of strapping chaps getting honours. There was me. And at the back of the room was a little lady, an elderly lady. So, of course, made a complete beeline for her and, introduced myself and asked, what brought her there that day. And she was a veteran of the Warsaw Uprising. Her name was Hanna Czarnocka. She was fabulous. She was a 16-year-old girl during the Warsaw Uprising. And she wasn't fighting with a gun in hand. She was just 16. But she had volunteered to try and get medical supplies from the destroyed shops, pharmacies, houses across the city and bring them back to the field hospitals, which are in cellars and basements. And she ran out one day and she was delighted. She got to the university and she found 10 glass bottles of methylated spirits, which she put in her rucksack because it could be used as antiseptic. And she was running back when she was caught in a Luftwaffe incendiary bombing raid, so a fire bombing raid. And she said buildings were crumbling around her. She felt something smash into her back, but she was saved by these glass bottles, just one smashed. And then she looked at the burning street and she suddenly felt cold because the meth had soaked through the material of the bag, through her shirt, and was evaporating off her back in this burning street. And she looked at me and she said, Claire, I knew then that I was going to die because I was a petrol bomb. But she just kept running and she actually made it back. She made it back and she delivered these methylated spirits to the field hospital. And the medics in there, all they said was, you've broken one. That was their response to it. I mean, that was the conditions that they're serving under. So I was just incredibly humbled to meet this veteran. I actually wrote a profile of her for, History Today magazine, I think it was. And she said, what are you doing here? So I was just like, nothing. I'm just a reporter. I'm getting a cultural honour, but really it's because I wrote an amazing woman's story. She said, "Oh, who?" Christina Scarbeck, Christine Granville. I said, "Oh yeah, she was a fantastic woman, amazing. But for goodness sake, why didn't you write about the real Polish hero, Zo?" It's actually not pronounced Zo. I have to say it's Zo, but we'll all call her Zo. It's short for Zofia. So so I had to say, "Well, who's Zo?" And that's what kicked me off. I interviewed a number of veterans. Then another woman, Marlena Schebel. I'm so sad we've lost both these ladies in the last couple of years, and several others who knew her. And I knew I had to tell this extraordinary story that's deliberately being kept secret for so long.
Well, so fantastic. And actually, I'm kicking myself now because when I was reading the book, I remember the story about the methylated spirits, and I hadn't connected that was the person that you'd originally spoken to. So that must make it even more special to be close to that. But
it was lovely to weave all these stories through of women that I'd interviewed who'd known her. And her daughter is a filmmaker today in London, and she was incredibly helpful during my research as well. So it's fabulous to have all these testimonies to put in the book.
So just before we started recording, I sort of said that these are the kinds of stories which we really wanted to tell as part of Influencers, and we've done women and men. We're going through a particularly angry point in our podcast because we're being told consistently about DEI being this thing that's gone too far and terrible. And one of the reasons why we want to tell these stories is, and what you have just explained, just as that tiny story before we get to Zo, is this is merit-based. There's nothing artificial about this. This is bravery, this is courage, this is achievements, and the fact that they are women is in that sense irrelevant. And that's what makes me so annoyed about these conversations, which is we try to make these false equivalencies when yet there is an example of if a man did that, we would be as impressed as if a woman did that. So
absolutely, in that example, and it is completely merit-based. You're absolutely right, and I'm glad to hear you mention achievements as well as courage. I think we're just beginning to change the dial there. Normally it's the women were so brave but didn't really cut the mustard, but they were very brave, but actually they did. They achieved an awful lot, and we need to be better at recognising that. So well done on that. But their gender is relevant. A lot of the time, I mean, the reason why women were so effective, often in the resistance and as female special agents being sent out to support resistance organisations across Europe and elsewhere, in fact, around the world, is because of the essential misogyny of the times, particularly Nazi Germany, incredibly misogynistic regime. Certainly early on, they found it hard to believe that women could be playing any significant role. So one of the first things Zoe did was that she creates a women's intelligence networks, not getting women's intelligence, getting intermilitary intelligence, but they're all women, because the women, they have this superpower. It's not that they're cute and flirty, it's that they're underestimated and virtually overlooked, especially early on. So she employed women, who worked as secretaries or translators in the German occupying authority buildings in Warsaw and across Poland. Well, particularly she was running Silesia, which is an area about the size of Wales, but very strategically important. And women who worked in laundrettes and bakeries, who were overhearing gossip, who could see the changing garrison bread orders or note the types of uniforms coming through to be washed and mended, what all the little marks were. Across a large region like that, you can see direction of troop movements and so on. And women whose houses overlooked railways and major thoroughfares, who could keep a note of the movement of military freight. And because she's using women, they are less likely. Any man of able-bodied man of conscription age was very suspect automatically, whereas women are moving around the whole time, carrying this information, carrying wireless sets, overseeing, making a note of who's moving down which thoroughfares and so on. And so they were able to make this very significant contribution, and partly aided by their gender. So gender is not irrelevant. And it's relevant in another way as well, because the men, so Poland, very early on, September 39, first country invaded, 1st of September 1939 by Nazi Germany, coming in from the west. 17 days later, they are invaded by the Soviet Red Army, coming in from the east. And obviously, we now know, they didn't know at the time, but there had been a deal between these two very aggressive powers to carve up Poland, and in fact, a lot of Eastern Europe, and take control of different zones. And as a result, Poland, who actually put up a good defence in the first couple of weeks of the war, it's often forgotten, realised they couldn't continue to fight effectively on two fronts. So they got the majority of their armed forces, 35,000 troops, out south through a city called Lvov, we now know as Lviv in Ukraine. And Zoe was one of those people keeping that route open and making petrol bombs to throw against enemy troops on both sides, ripping up paving slabs to barricade the road to get all these people out. Also got the government out, the treasury, the first Enigma code breakers and so on. So hugely important work. And she could have gone out to serve with these young men. A number of women went and they served as drivers and translators and clerks, secretaries and so on. But she decided the best way she could continue to serve her country was as a member of the Home Army. So the army that gets out, the 35,000 troops, that's the Polish armed forces overseas. And they play a significant role again in the Battle of France. They come to Britain, they serve again. Significant early Allied armed forces. The men that stay behind are known, they create this, and with the women, they create this resistance force called the Home Army, as opposed to the armed forces overseas. And it's one of the largest and most incredibly organised resistance forces in occupied Europe. And Zoe is part of that. Now, again, there is a difference with the women because the men are still soldiers. They're considered soldiers in what becomes an recognised allied army. But the women don't have legal military status as soldiers because they're women, right? Even if they're doing the same stuff. So they are seen as volunteers. So they don't have rank. They don't have, pay is kind of a bit irrelevant at this point. They don't have protections under the Geneva Convention and so on. So it is, it's never a level playing field. It's never the same. But the actual work itself, ironically, often women may be better qualified for it.
Such an exciting story. Let's go back. So you casually throw in that she became part of the Home Army, and actually, I think you talked about that when she started Network. Part of this is about what makes people tick. How did she get to this point? We've almost taken a leap and a jump that says a woman all of a sudden is now an important member of the Home Army and actually has built a network. In fact, I believe she builds 2 networks in the end. How did she get from pre-war person not in the military, no Germans or Russians on the territory, to that point where all of a sudden she is leading an intelligence network?
Well, I think we have to go right back to her childhood and even further back than that. I'm sorry, I'll try and do this quickly.
No, we take as much time as you want.
At the start of the book, and we do get into the action straight away. But she is born in a historical Polish city called Toruń. It's beautiful. I've been up there a lot. It's a garrison town. It's got this beautiful star-shaped wall around it. It's a bit like Carcassonne, but Polish. But when she was born, it was actually part of the Prussian Empire, because Poland has this history, centuries of being invaded and annexed and occupied by its very aggressive neighbouring countries and empires. And so when she was born, it was part of the Prussian Empire, which is an earlier German empire. Okay, so legally, when she's born, she's German. So you said, let's go back to when there's no Germans on the territory. Well, she actually is legally born German, but inside she knows her parents are deeply patriotic Poles, and they bring her up knowing very well, with the old songs and the stories and the history and the heritage and culture of Poland. But the Prussian Empire is very keen to eliminate that as far as possible, cultural cleansing, if you like. So it's illegal for her to speak her mother tongue, is to speak Polish. So she grows up speaking German. So she's a fluent German speaker, becomes very useful. She actually has to have a different name. Elżbieta is Elizabeth. It's the Polish version of Elizabeth. But she has to be called in public. She has to be called Lisa or Liesel, the German version of Elizabeth. And what the German Empire clearly doesn't realise is it's training women like her, particularly her, to be perfect double agents in the future. She's grown up with a second identity from youth. She knows how to mix absolutely perfectly as a German, to be a German, but she knows very well she's Polish. So she's full of this, she said she sucked in patriotism with her mother's milk. I love that phrase. And then Poland regains its independence after 120 plus years of being divided up, annexed and occupied. And she's a young teenager, and one of her formative memories is seeing her father at the end of the First World War, with, he's a big man, a veteran himself, but he has tears coursing down his cheeks with all his mates, and she's out there holding his hand because they're hearing the Polish national anthem being played publicly in the streets of Poland for the first time. And this really, she swears to herself that she's going to defend the freedom of her country and the freedom of herself to be Elżbieta, to be the Pole that she knows she is. And so it's horrific for her when on her watch, only another 20 years later, the Second World War and Poland is invaded again. But she's already been prepping for it. So when she's at university, she's a mathematician. She actually studied alongside Marian Rejewski, and he was the linchpin, one of the early code breakers, Enigma code breakers. So she's got a brilliant mind as well. But her real passion becomes the armed forces, and she joins something called the Women's Military Auxiliary, and they run military training camps for women. The concept is that Polish women have actually served a lot historically in conflicts. There were women, some of them dressed as men, some of them serving as medics on hospital trains. There were women back 1863 in Poland. That battle is sometimes referred to as the women's fight, because there were so many women serving, although without legal authority. And the idea, a lot of these women who are veterans themselves, is that we shouldn't wait until we have to spontaneously provide some service because we're needed. We should prepare so that we can be quite strategic, like the armed forces. So they set up this women's military training organisation, and Zoe very quickly becomes a senior leader in that organisation. So she knows, she's trained in how to fight, she's trained in how to treat battle wounds, she's trained in she drives a tank briefly at one point in the war, which she loved. She can ride a horse, she can shoot. So she's very highly trained when war comes. She's actually one of the very first women to serve in the Second World War, because she was on an air base, staying on an air base on the 1st of September 1939, and she's woken up at 5 a.m. by the Luftwaffe bombing raid as they invade Polish airspace, and of course come over on the land as well. And she's immediately up and in uniform and into action. So from the very early hours of 1st of September 39.
So part of this is about trying to get a little bit below the story and understand. And I think the two things you've called out there is, and I'm going to use words we've used in the podcast about traditional leadership management, mission. From a very early age, she absolutely understand what she wanted to do, and that she was passionate about that. Mm-hmm. But also you used a word, and it was interesting because you used it sort of coincidentally, was strategy. She had a very clear strategy for how she was going to achieve this. So this was not a person who, as it were, accidentally became a spy. This was a person from a very young age was almost building blocks to enable, should this ever be needed, to sort of do this. I'm careful not to reveal too much from the book, because it really is, I know I've already said it and I'll say it probably a couple more times, it's a fantastic read.
Feel free to say that. Yeah.
Well, there's an episode at the beginning of the war which I thought was a very small episode but very telling, that perhaps you would tell that story. And that was as she was going back home when the rest of the Polish army had left, and I believe she came to a river which was sort of a crossing point where she might have to show some papers or talk to some guards. Can you tell a little bit of that story? Because I thought that was such a fascinating early example of leadership and how you tackle serious problems with real jeopardy, how you might deal with that.
There's two bridge stories in the first chapter which are both extraordinary. So one is on the way out. She has to cross the river Vistula. She's been sent to Lvov, to this key strategic city, and she's in her uniform. She's got her unit with her. They've requisitioned a bus, but they soon have to abandon that bus, breaks down, whatever. So they're hitching a ride. They get a ride in an army vehicle with loads of petrol in tanks, which obviously must have made quite a juicy target for the Stuka dive bombers beginning to strafe in that airspace. And the women say, we can carry on fighting in civvies, but we'll be less of a target. Let's take our uniforms off, throw them away. And she's like, absolutely not. We are in the first few days of the war, we're not getting rid of our uniforms now. Come on, women. So they all kind of get behind her. Yeah, we're serving. And they keep going. And they get to the last bridge across Vistula, and it's already been, rigged up with dynamite. They're going to blow it. It's on this, it's on the route that they want to stop the Germans coming in. They want to slow them down. So they're about to blow the bridge. And it's only because they're still in uniform that these women, they're the last people allowed across the bridge because they're clearly going to serve. And the civilians, there's this scene of a complete crush and rearing horses and screaming people. No one else is allowed to go over. So that's her showing her leadership. And so that's great. On the way back, it's quite different because now it's an occupied obviously it's an occupied city immediately, and you have the Vistula, who was initially part of the wartime border between the Soviet and the Nazi German side. So they have to get across, and she's traveling with a friend, another woman, because they want to join the resistance back in their home area where they've got more contacts, they can be more effective in their role. And they consider swimming across, but they realise that the Red Army are just taking pot shots at heads going across the river, and her friend's not well either. So that's out. They're meant to have a guide. They pay him some money, but he does a runner and they're left with no money, and they're in this appalling situation. And so she says to her friends, right, I'll deal with this. So they go to the bridge, and they go on the Soviet side, and the Soviet soldiers, the Red Army soldiers, going, what the hell are you women doing? And so who, fortunately also has blonde hair and blue eyes. I'm not saying that all Germans have blonde hair and blue eyes, of course, not far from it, but it didn't hurt her that she met a stereotype there that people kind of expected. And because she speaks fluent German, she just starts talking to them, and she says, my whole family, I'm on the wrong side. My family are over there. I'm German. I want to be the German side. And you're allies with, the Soviets were allied with Germany at this point. And they let the two women over. So she just, she could easily have been got them both shot at that point, but she's just very convincing and realised the best way is just plain subterfuge, and she's got the skills and she's got the courage. So, yeah, I mean, this is a very minor story.
No, I know, but what I loved about the story was, and it was, I actually, as I was looking through the book, and I was reading these stories in chapter 1 and chapter 2, I was thinking, hang on a minute, there's a lot more chapters to go. How is she going to get through this? But what was really fascinating to me about both of those stories, and actually I was thinking of the one where she just fronts up and says, get out of my way, I'm going through. You talked about sort of that courage and the ability to think on the fly. But the bit that I sort of, and I apologize because I've done this sometimes with authors before, and they say sort of I report the facts rather than interpret them. But why this is a really good example of people following her. And throughout the book, there are people who have lots of good reasons not to follow her. There is jeopardy, there is danger, and yet they seem to follow her. As you said, she tells her comrades, don't take your uniforms off. We're in the military. We're going to go through. She says to her friend, follow me. I'm going to do this. Why do you think people followed her?
Well, she had an incredibly forceful personality, is one. She's very effective in her role. People see her being effective. People see her getting through places. And it's like when you're watching the telly and you think, okay, I want to be with that person because they're clearly going to make it. Whereas that person, usually a mum, is definitely not going to make it. And you can see she is pretty effective at this. Let's stick with her. So she has this. She has charisma through being effective herself, and her own inner strength and determination. She has all these skills. She's got a lot in play there. But I think also she taps into something very deep. A lot of Polish people were incredibly, there have been generations of people who have been brought up saying, when our turn comes, if we get the opportunity to bring back a free and independent Poland, we're going to fight for it. This is a very important part of the psychology of the occupied Poles in the previous generations. So she taps into something very fundamental there. She is enabling people who've often, wanted, when it comes, am I going to be courageous enough? When we think, if we are called upon, and I have no sense of direction, I've got no language skills, I think I'm a bit of a coward, I think I'll be awful. But in that situation, if I found someone who I thought was really effective, really brilliant, and could enable me to be my best self, that's her. So she's the person I want to be with. She's the person who can help me be the hero I could possibly be if people were really helpful around me, a part of a team. She's that. So I think most people want to, obviously a lot of people just want to survive. They want to help their families survive. They're in incredibly stressful situations. There's a lot in play here, but there's an awful lot of people who are looking for that leadership to bring them on side, and she is that.
This is why we love having these conversations, because they seem so far away from day-to-day life today. But I think you've captured this is in a business, this is in an organization. Okay, this was a very a highly dangerous, and it was this crazy story. But this is true of everyone everywhere we go. People follow people that demonstrate effectiveness, have a mission. There's something that people want to follow about that. So thank you. We'll talk about this a bit later on as well, maybe sort of later. But so obviously I'm going to skip over the network she builds, but let's just repeat that. She builds two significant intelligent networks in Poland, which in itself, there's a whole story, there's a whole episode. But you mentioned
almost 50% of Britain's wartime intelligence from Europe came from just Poland alone. So the work she's doing is of huge significance there, yeah.
Well, let's fast forward to something you said, where you said she was made an emissary. And so she is asked to now return to London. And again, I'm going to keep some of the exciting parts of the story, but she makes her way to the Pyrenees. And believe me, in getting to the Pyrenees, there are enough challenges. There's enough zigzags along the way.
Of those briefly.
Well, you are welcome. I'm trying really hard not to sort of share all the excitement of the books that people go looking at them. But tell us, sorry, because
we can't possibly tell it all. Don't worry.
Well, so let's talk a bit about that, because again, one of the stories that struck me, where this is an incredible story, but then it starts to become a very personal. How do you keep going in the face of these challenges? The story that I was interested in you talking a bit more about was her literally trying to cross the Pyrenees. And again, it was another one of these where I turned to my wife and said, you're not going to believe what's happened now. So can you talk a bit about that? Why is she going back to London? What is she carrying? Because I think that's really significant in terms of achievements and importance in the war. And maybe a little bit about some of her challenges of getting back to London, because surely going back from occupied Poland to London, I mean, I can do that in a couple of hours now on a flight. How easy or hard was that for Zoe?
It ain't easy. I'm also, by the way, feeling quite sorry for your wife. Hello there. Apologies. So at this point, she has already served as a courier. She becomes one of the main couriers for the Polish Home Army. She's on one of the most perilous routes, which is to go from Warsaw in and out of Berlin. So right into the heart of the Nazi Third Reich, because a lot of the information they have is obviously time sensitive troop movements and so on. Movement of U-boats and monitoring, all sorts of things. So they want to get this information to the Polish government in exile. So the government got out through Lvov, it went to Angers in France, set up, then it went to London, where it's established long-term in the war. And they're sharing that information with their allies, of course, with the Brits and so on. So to do that, I mean, initially they went through France. After the fall of France, June 40, they have to look for new routes, and they find the fastest way they can get this information to London is going into Berlin, giving it to a friendly contact at the Manchurian embassy, actually, who can get it out in the diplomatic post. So Zoe has this incredible experience traveling as a German. She's got false papers as a German, and then she nearly gets caught. The network is betrayed at one point, and she's very close. Has to jump from a moving train, and that's all before this stuff. She manages to get away. It's a shocker. So then at that point, she knows she can't continue to work those routes. She's burnt on those routes, but they don't want to waste her. And she knows she's not a modest woman. She knows she's got some skills that are useful there. But even she is astounded by the new orders she gets, because she is asked by the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Army, so Europe's biggest resistance armed forces at this point, to take two very precious microfilms all the way to Europe. So one of them is full of information, the sort of thing we've been talking about, that kind of military intelligence, U-boat movements, ship movements, German industry, where the factories are that could be bombed, to take out the material production for the German war effort, and all of that sort of information. And the other one has overview of the resistance, particularly in Poland, but across Europe as well. All this will be very useful for SOE, of course, and also fairly early information on the Holocaust. And so that is the creation of the ghetto system, the concentration camps, particularly Auschwitz, which of course is the Nazi German concentration camp inside occupied Polish territory that the Germans are running, and other information, broader information on the Holocaust as well. So there's a whole lot. One of these is microfilm is round a pin that's in the shaft of a door key, and the other one's in a little brass cigarette lighter, a little cube of brass. So loved it, actually, even though she didn't smoke. I always think that's a little bit risky, but anyhow, it was wonderful that you could light a cigarette with it and it wouldn't burn the microfilm inside, but you could dispose of the microfilm in another way. It's pretty high tech, amazing stuff. So she's sent with these 2 microfilm to get to London, and she is sent with 2 missions to undertake in London as well on the personal authority of the commander of the Home Army. So she's the only female emissary that I've come across in the war. So that's the personal representative of a commander of an army. And there are four people sent out. There's 3 others. They're couriers. They're not emissaries. They don't have orders to undertake when they get to London. And they're all guys. And she's actually the only one that reaches London and who also doesn't lose her microfilm. Bit of a star. And it's this extraordinary journey. It's 1,000 miles of enemy occupied territory. And the very first thing she has to do is go back into Berlin, even though she knows that's the route she's just been burnt on. So she's got new identity papers. Obviously, she's constantly changing her hair, glasses on, off, different clothes, the whole thing, different name. And she learned to walk in different ways, to present herself differently and all the rest of it. But nevertheless, absolutely perilous to go back on that same route. And like I said, we can't do it all. Gets to Berlin, gets out, gets to Strasbourg, high drama at the border at Strasbourg, but gets across into northern France, so that's occupied France, and has to cross the demarcation zone, actually, as it's being dismantled, to get into southern France. So this is roughly the time of Torch, Operation Torch, now North Africa. And she hides again on a train. She has a terrible time with trains during.
I was about to say, there's anyone who likes trains, likes traveling on trains.
There's a bit of train action in this.
Go read this, because there's a bit of that.
Yeah, so she hides. She picks Pierre Laval's personal train. So he's the collaborationist PM who's working with the Germans. She rightly thinks there'll be less checks on his train, and she hides in the water tender. She thinks that's pretty cool. No one's going to think of that. And she meets 7 men from the resistance in the same place.
Awkward.
They get on quite well. Nearly drowned though when they fill the water tender up again halfway on the journey. But anyhow, they make it, and she gets to Tarascon, this village in the mountains, to cross the Pyrenees. And I'm not sure which part of that story you're after. I mean, it's just extraordinary. I think
it's the fact that she has, again, there's other stuff for us to get onto, but I think there's literally 3 attempts for her to cross the Pyrenees.
That's right.
And being shot at least twice.
Yeah, she's shot at in the mountain, the freezing mountain passes. Of course, it's completely freezing as well. She's got as much chocolate with her. I mean, I do love her. She's carrying as much chocolate as possible, but not everyone makes it over those mountains. So one of the men she's travelling with at one point is frozen to death. And of course, there is the ever-present danger. And she looks down at one point, and there's this bright colour on the snow. She looks down, it's red, and she realises it's a box of cigarettes, empty cigarette box, and it's German, and she knows there's a border patrol nearby. So she makes it, and it is extraordinarily perilous, even before they start, when she's meeting her guide in the hotel, and some of those young Frenchmen come along, and they're nearly arrested by the mountain border police even before they set off. In fact, all the young Frenchmen are arrested at that point. And even though she's dressed for hiking through the mountains, she just takes her gloves and hat and scarf off and coat, and she just puts a white serviette over her arm and walks past them all as if she's a waitress, and gets away, manages to get upstairs in the hotel, where she's thrown out of a high window into a bank of snow, meets a quite nice young man down at the bottom of it. So that worked quite well, actually. But anyhow, those 2 and their guide eventually managed to cross the Pyrenees, and she gets into neutral Spain.
We'll come back to neutral Spain, because there's a little twist even in neutral Spain, and it leads us on to sort of getting back to London. But as an author, when you're writing this stuff, do you ever worry that it sounds too far-fetched? Because if you wrote a novel that was completely made up, and you repeat, and in that novel that the heroine did these things, I think a lot of people would say, well, look, I mean, this is great, but it's now getting a bit unbelievable.
Getting a bit silly, isn't it?
I mean, it really is.
That's why I'm not a novelist, well, that, and I couldn't make up dialogue, and I'm not very good at plot, but we've got enough plots in real life. It speaks to me because I know this actually happened, and I do have about 1,000 footnotes, I think. So somebody actually bought the book and complained because they said, that the bottom, the last tenth of it is all footnotes. It's like, it's already over my word count, it's as big. I mean, it's not a huge book. It's a nice, easy book to read. But yeah, I mean, I haven't, everything in there is from an archive. I cross-reference as much as possible. I do my stuff. So no, I'm just absolutely delighted. Things like that chapter. I've got this one chapter where she makes that journey, and I mean, it was great fun to write, because it's action all the way. But you're thinking, oh, I'm not getting much character development in here, or I'm not, what's the strategic importance? What's the military significance? That, whatever, so you have to kind of balance these things. But what's great about Zoe's story is that she basically, it's this extraordinary story of the war that we don't think enough about, what was happening in Poland, what they contributed, the value of their contribution, what happened to Poland afterwards. She's right at the heart of this incredible story we don't think about enough. And she's really goddamn cool and amazing. So, yeah.
Well, and I've read many history books over the years, and I'm sure you have as well. And there is that risk, which is that moment you're in the middle of the book and you're thinking, this is hard work. This is an important story, but oh God, this is hard work to read it. This reads like a novel. This is almost why I sort of talked about it like that, because it really does read like an adventure novel, and then it's interspersed with sort of the richer detail in the background. Anyway, let's get back to the story, because I want to touch on, again, getting a little bit to the heart. One of the things we like to do with some of our influences is make sure we don't put them on pedestals. What we've found is that great people who have had these kind of influences, not just on the world around them, but later life, but are not perfect. So good example is, and correct me, I'm sure I'll get this slightly wrong. So she makes it across the Pyrenees. She says to the British government, I am the emissary of the Home Army and I need to be brought back to London. And there is a seat on an aircraft flying back to London, which she doesn't get. And she doesn't get because a man is given the seat, a man who has less important information. Unbelievable. And then she does get back to London, and now she's working with the Polish government in exile. How does that go? You would imagine she'd be fated. You would imagine they will say, this is an expert. This is one of our foremost resistance leaders who has proven herself time and time again. Presumably she has a fantastic time in London. Yeah,
you've set it up nicely for the fall. I mean, obviously she gets there and they don't know whether to salute her or bow and kiss her hand, in a sort of chivalry demonstration. So yeah, it's really tough, and it's made much harder for her. So both the Brits and the Poles in Britain are very sexist. This is the 1940s. That's what it was like. But it's made extra difficult because she's been sent out by Stefan Grot-Rowecki. Grot is his code name. It means spearhead. So she's been sent out by him, and he has one of the missions he's sent her out. Well, he sent her with two missions. One is to sort out the London end of the land communication courier routes. It's working really well from the Polish end. That's Zoe and her friend Emilia Malesa, who is running this. It's called Farmstead, the land route courier system. But at the London route, there's lots of delays. People aren't getting back fast enough, and they need that sorted out, made more efficient. So that's number one. Number two is she's asked to secure the legal military status of women in the Home Army. Now, Grot-Rowecki, very tough guy. He's not doing this. He's not a equal opportunities employer, progressive employer. None of those terms existed at that time. He's not doing it to be nice to the ladies. He is doing it because women not having the same status of men in the Home Army causes problems. It makes them much less efficient, and it leads to security breaches, and it means they don't have protections. And so he just wants to sort that out. There's a lot of women serving in these roles. The day-to-day running of the Home Army right from the start couldn't have happened without women working as messengers and couriers. And now they're in all sorts of roles. So another of the women in the book is a friend of Zoe's called Sophia Franio, and she is a medical doctor. But she's also one of their heads of sabotage and the use of explosives. And she trains women. They have a cellular structure. She has all these groups of women in groups of 5 who don't know who's in the other groups. It's all a bit like the IRA. It's that kind of cellular system, but they're all very highly trained, and they've all been through this sexism as well. So there's women playing all sorts of roles, and they just need to be treated as soldiers of the Home Army. What the time it takes her to get from Warsaw to London, Grot-Rowecki, this commander, has actually been betrayed, and he's been arrested by the Germans, and he will go on to be executed in the summer of 44. So she doesn't have him saying, yeah, this is my orders. anymore. So she has to kind of do it on her own, and they just don't believe her. So with the first mission, the London end of the courier system's being organised by a man called Kazimierz Bilski, and he is a fantastic fella. He's already served in the defence of Poland. Then he's gone out through Lviv, through that route that Zoe helped to keep open, served again in the Battle of France with his unit, and he's got his entire unit without a casualty back to Britain in 1940, not through Dunkirk, actually, through a port further east. So he's good. And they select him as one of the few, the cream of the forces that get back to Britain. The Polish forces are selected to be in the Polish elite special forces. They're called the Cichociemni, which means the silent unseen. And it's another unknown story that they're trained around Britain and Scotland and Essex and Audley End House. It was part of the SOE, P section of the SOE. They'd never see themselves as that. They are very, very independent part of that organisation. So they are the Cichociemni, the silent unseen. And he's one of them. And he meets Zoe, and he calls her a captain in a skirt. He can't just call her a captain, and she's pretty tough with them. And he thinks, okay, well, I better butter her up. I'll soften her up. He's a very good looking. His matinee idol kind of looks as well, Ram. I do love him. And he's got a brilliant turn of phrase. That's what I really like about him. And fortunately, he wrote anonymously in this collection, a book of anonymously published, but we can work out who he is, Recollections of the Home Army. And he said, I thought, he's used to a lot of adoration from the ladies. So they're crossing St. James's Park. This is the spring of 1943. So nice weather, birdsong, bluebells, it's all quite good. And he suddenly stops and he stretches into his pocket and he pulls out, flourishes these silk stockings at her. And he says she's absolutely... what did he say? Her response was astounding, because Zoe suddenly realises what the problem is at the London end of the courier system. Because these guys, had she have taken a pair of silk stockings, the only women wearing silk stockings in Nazi German occupied Poland are the wives of Gestapo officers. So had she have taken them, it would have been a tell immediately. She'd have been arrested had she have gone back. And she realises he's got no idea what the conditions in enemy occupied territory are. And this is what the problem is. In Warsaw, across Poland, the Home Army is working day and night. She's up in the early hours coding the messages to be sent by radio. They're all working together. They're imagining that in London, the Home Army representatives there are working through the night. It's a team. But they're not. They're in London. They're doing a 9 to 5. On a Friday, they clock off at 5 and they don't start work till 9 again on Monday morning. And this is what the problem is. That's why there's all these delays. They haven't got that sense of urgency. They don't have any information on the system. There's very few people coming out. So she can let them know what's going on. Her sister has been arrested and sent to Ravensbrück. Her brother has been sent to Auschwitz, where actually he's beaten to death, although they didn't know that at that moment. So she knows the life and death of it, and they are working almost in sort of not peacetime conditions, no, but they're not under occupation. It's a very, very different situation. So she manages to sort things out. And actually, Rum and his team of men, they come to really like her. She and Rum become good mates in the end, but goes through a tricky patch for sure.
A tricky patch, and certainly you get the feeling that, I think, if I remember rightly, SOE write a report on her, and it's sort of quite an exasperated kind of a report about what this woman is. Is there a sense...
SOE also propose her for the OBE. So
it's remarkable, isn't it?
Makes
All
no
of
sense.
this. Is there a sense, though, that would there have been a better way for her to bring the people in London around? So
she's fairly uncompromising in her character, if you like.
I think the point.
So I've got this bit where I think, when she arrives, she does have some goodwill. They kind of think, oh, she's a woman, but so was Joan of Arc. Maybe it's a bit mythological. Maybe she's, So they do have this, wow, how do I relate to you sort of thing. So there is that. And she squanders that goodwill in days. But on the other hand, they have squandered the goodwill of the Polish Home Army resistance, who are putting their lives on the line for the last 3 years by not responding quickly enough. So in some sense, yes, she could have been more amenable and got them round. Well, but perhaps her taking this more abrasive approach really shows them, man or woman, this is the reality. And they do sort the systems out, and they do change it, and they make efficiencies, and they change their approach. And eventually Rum and Zoe end up working alongside each other in the Warsaw Uprising as comrades in arms and respecting each other correctly.
So a big chunk of so again, you skipped over this, that she is the first Polish woman to parachute back in. She joined the silent. She joined the
Christina Scarbeck parachuted from North Africa to enemy-occupied France, but Zoe is the only woman to parachute from Britain to Poland.
And she was. Am I right in thinking there are only 200 silent unseen? It's a very small number of them.
316, yeah.
This is as elite as it will be. So again, this other incredible, remember we started nearly an hour ago talking about a woman who was proud of being Polish, who started an intelligence network that was critical to gathering information for the war, comes back to London and is now made a member of the silent unseen. This is an incredible story. We don't have time, and I don't want to not do justice to the Warsaw Uprising, but actually, and you dedicate quite a significant chunk of the book to the uprising, and
it's one chapter,
and I felt that was. I couldn't help but be angry reading that chapter because of the betrayals all round and the sort of the sadness of people trying to help and failing to do so. But there's another story there, which again, go read the book. And if you're not familiar with the Warsaw Uprising, and I had a very brief understanding of what the uprising was and how it worked, but of course she played a big part in that. Moving to after the war, maybe to sort of to bring us a little bit to a close. So the war has ended. I know that we've talked about some other famous Polish military figures who, for example, Bridge Too Far and Arnhem, General Sosabowski ends up being a waiter in London after the war because it's sort of not recognized, and also the political challenges. Can you talk just a little bit about what happens to Zoe after the war? Because again, I think this is yet another example of her resilience when you might say the war's over, I'm done. I've done my duty. I'm now going to go and give a bit back to myself. She doesn't do that again. She continues to serve her country and serve her beliefs.
So we need to remember VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. In London, we're all celebrating with, tea parties and Churchill and the Royals waving, and everyone is like, what a relief, fantastic. I mean, obviously there's still the Pacific Theatre, so it's not the end of the war, but there is this sense of VE Day being some closure for a lot of people, but it's not in Poland. If you are in Poland, you are left with in the Soviet sphere of influence, so you are left with a Soviet-backed communist regime imposed on Poland. So the Polish government in exile in London continues their role as a government in exile, but they are no longer recognized by the Allies. The Allies recognize the imposed communist regime in Poland. I mean, we still need Russia, in the war against Japan and so on. We still need all that. The Cold War is imminent, but neither Britain nor America has the resources or public support to continue the war. And I think in Poland, there's still this feeling that they're the first invaded nation. Britain goes to war and France essentially for Poland, for Polish freedom, and yet they end the war with peace, but not with freedom. So they many of them feel they've just swapped one occupation for another. And it's a very brutal regime. And so Zoe, like many of the men, like Rum, at the end of the Warsaw Uprising, he goes out and into a prisoner of war camp with his head held high. And eventually he's repatriated, like Sosabowski, like Komorowski, Komorowski's in Castle Colditz for a while, but then he comes back. And they have a hard time in Britain. Britain's first mass immigration policy was the allowing the Poles in Britain to remain, or those coming back from prisoner of war camps, because they knew if they went back to communist Poland, one of the first things that regime did was they round up a lot of the resistance leaders. They send them to Moscow for a show trial, and then they execute them, and then they start on the next layer down. And they are executing thousands of senior leaders of the Polish Resistance Home Army in the peace after the war, because they feel that they will be potential linchpins for resistance against the Soviet-imposed communist regime in Poland. And by the 1950s, in the 1950s, we have our first sort of big recognition of the fact that women, British women played a role, and French women, and in fact 13 different nations of women, in as agents with SOE, going behind enemy lines to support the resistance. We have films like Odette and then Carve Her Name with Pride. And it's, people are astounded. It's told fairly romantically, I must say, but nevertheless, I love those films. And it was the first sort of recognition. And in Poland, they begin to recognise that women had played a role as well. And in 1951, and this is one of the great ironies of her story, is that she's a hairbreadth of being caught by the Nazis throughout the war. She just manages to evade Nazi German arrest numerous times. And in the piece in 1951, she's arrested by her own government, the Polish government, be it the communist Polish government, and she's sentenced to 10 years, and she's tortured brutally, but she survives, and she doesn't talk, and eventually she does get released early after Stalin's death, but she serves many years, and she keeps fighting against that regime. They constantly consider her seditious. They arrest her again in 1976. They destroy her career. She's absolutely hounded, but she keeps fighting all the way through. And one of the most extraordinary interviews I did was with Lech Wałęsa, the president, who had been the leader of Solidarity. And she has been fighting alongside Solidarity after the war as well. And this is why her story isn't known, because that communist regime, even when she's released from detention, they make damn sure that her story is hidden. And she secretly collects the stories of soldiers from Pomerania, her home territory, and of the women who served as well. And it's only because that she got this information, she interviewed everyone, all those witnesses who are no longer with us. She triangulated that. She was an academic, so she cross-referenced the sources, she cross-checked it all, and she kept records secretly hidden inside her drawers of her cupboards and friends' houses and so on the backs of envelopes. And we still have all that. And that was one of the archives that I was going through, with her appalling handwriting on the backs of envelopes, trying to work out what was going on, who they are, and what, and it's fantastic. And it's only when Poland finally got their freedom, 1980, 1991, Lech Wałęsa actually gives her the highest Polish honour of all, the Order of the White Eagle. Not that she was that bothered, but he did what she really appreciated, and she was proud of. He promotes her. Because she did that work, she did manage to secure the legal status of women in the Home Army. So at the end of the Warsaw Uprising, when people are brought out to prisoner of war camps, it's the only time in the war that Germany set up prisoner of war camps for women, for female combatants. And instead, previously, they were either just executing the women or sending them to be worked to death as forced labourers. And this saves thousands of lives, including Hanna Czarnocka, who we started with, that woman with the glass bottles of methylated spirits. She was in one of those camps. Her life was saved because of that. And so eventually Lech Wałęsa promotes her to the rank of general, brigadier general, retired. Only second woman in Polish history. So.
And I think that's, and you passed over it before, but just to go back to the story, when she was officially made a captain, I believe that was a self-imposed rank. She said, well, I think I'm a captain, so I'm going to be a captain. And they all nodded and said, congratulations, captain.
Well, but I think she is actually made a captain by Komorowski, who's the commander of the Home Army after Stefan Rowecki has been arrested and killed. And he's in charge during the Warsaw Uprising. They're not running that campaign. And he does, he promotes a number of these women and gives them rank. And some of them are just like, well, that's a demotion, actually. I've already been serving at this level. That's where I'm recognised. But she is officially, yeah.
I get the feeling, having listened to the story, that promotion to that rank possibly was something, I'm imagining, was something she probably cared about more than, you mentioned that she was awarded this highest honour. Actually, she had multiple honours through the war as she was awarded medals. Yeah. But I think
she didn't receive any for another 40 years, of course, until after the war, until they got freedom. But
I'm guessing the promotion was that representation that women have a place and are respected, and without sort of overly doing the sort of the role of women in this is all merit based. Nothing here is about being nice because they're women. She deserved that through and through. Thank you for the story. I want to touch on just one or two other things before we finish today. The first one is, whenever I've done these influencers, and whether we've read books and whether we've looked at other articles and things, I always worry that I don't have the voice of the influencer. What I end up doing is reporting what happened, but I'm really nervous that I lose the voice of the influencer. We did Amelia Earhart recently, and all I managed to find was about 20 seconds of audio, and of course her book, but even her book wasn't quite her voice.
God, but I hope you got, with Amelia Earhart, I hope you got the letter that she wrote to her husband just before they get married.
Certainly did.
Cracking. You get her character completely in that. So I'm not really into marriage. I'm not going to be held down by you. I'm going to have affairs with other people. It's got to be on my terms or nothing. The night before they get married, and he's like, okay. So yeah, I think we do get Amelia Earhart's character, but anyhow, that's a different story.
No, but I'm so glad you touched on the one of the things we called out on the episode, which was how incredible it was. But even then, you don't get the voice. I believe you have heard her voice. Now, obviously, she passed away. I'm going to say 2019. I'm going to get that wrong. Was it earlier?
2009.
No, 2009, and there was a 9 in it. But I believe that you have heard her voice. Can you talk about the bit? And more importantly, what did you learn about the person rather than the story?
Well, I think her character comes across very forcefully. It couldn't come across any other way in this book. From pretty early on, I think you've got a good picture of who she is and how she acts and what motivates her. And that's something that I loved. It was a real golden thread. It was she's such a strong character. It made it not easy for me, but I hope I did due care and credit. But so I don't think there's a problem with that. But that, literally hearing her voice, if that's what you were asking as well.
Yes.
So part of my research, I spent a lot of time out in Poland researching this, which was great fun. And at one point, I met Lech Wałęsa's press secretary. It's a man called Andrzej Dziedziński. And he, at that time, he had been a journalist. This is inside communist Poland before the wall fell. And so he has gone to interview her, but it's actually seditious to interview people, and especially people like her, who, there is actually the state security services are following her and recording her, and they have a massive file on her. So they are watching. And but he nevertheless wants to interview her, and he recorded her on these tapes, and it was just fantastic. He said, "Do you want to hear her voice?" We were sitting in the cafe at the World War II Museum in Gdansk, and he put them in a tape deck, which still had the little solidarity sticker on all those years later, and from back in the day. And he played her voice, and it was wonderful to hear her forceful. She was banging on the desk. Sometimes I could hardly hear her because the only person I've interviewed like that, I interviewed Glenda Jackson once, and she was smoking away and banging on the desk. So I could hardly hear what she said on the tape afterwards. So it was a bit like that. And sometimes she chokes up with emotion, but a lot of times she's kind of laughing heartily as well, though she's got quite a soft Pomeranian Polish accent. But and then the tape went to an end. I mean, I don't speak Polish, but it was wonderful just to hear the flavour of her voice, if you like. The tape came to an end, and it clunked, and then this martial music bled out. We were getting shushed at by the other people on other tables, so he quickly turned it off. And I said, "Andre, I just didn't think you were a marching band kind of guy. Can I just ask what that music was?" And he said, "Well, it was illegal to interview people on record like that. So the only tapes, the best tapes he could get, you couldn't buy blank tapes, but the best tapes you could put a bit of sellotape over the tab. If you're a certain age, we know we used to do that to tape over.
We certainly do.
Was the state tapes. And so he literally recorded the testimony of this freedom fighter over the propaganda of the regime, which ended up with this martial music. So I just loved the irony in that as well. And then he was so astounded when he interviewed her. He said, "Zoe, I'd like to write your story." And she considered it for a while and then decided against it. It was too much about her. She's quite modest. She wanted it more about collective effort and not just all the focus on her. So she made him promise not to write it. And he respected that, even though she died in 2009, he never wrote it. And then he looked at me and said, "But I never said I wouldn't share it." And he pushed the tapes across the table, 28 tapes. I had to get them transcribed and translated. And is at that moment I knew I had her voice. I had enough to write this book.
That's exactly what I meant. And I think you've summed that up so beautifully, which is it's difficult to sometimes really see someone doing these things. But you said banging the fist on the table, there's a passion and a charisma and a drive. There's laughter, which says there's times for death-defying feats and jumping out of aeroplanes, and there's time for jokes. And she was nearly in tears because of the emotion. That was what I was really trying to get at, which is what's the voice of the person, because I think that's just as important as everything else you say. Is that, and ultimately this is what the whole point is: why do people follow people? What makes them so great, and what makes them such great influencers? Last question. I don't, you might say that you can't answer this because it's slightly an odd one, but as a female agent, as part of that generation of agents, what do you think her legacy is today in the world of both the military and also secret agents? I'm not an expert in this area, but do you think there's a direct line between some of the agents in the world today and the work that she did?
I do think so. So I think the legacy of Zoe and all these people is absolutely massive. And you know, that legacy includes victory in the Second World War. These people made a very significant contribution for that. Zoe certainly did. And you've got numerous examples of that. The amount of intelligence she managed to gather, the amount of intelligence as a courier she took across borders that she got to Britain, etc., etc. Also, Polish freedom. So she continues the fight after the war. She's also involved in rebuilding her country. She works in education. She's, you know, high flyer, whatever she tries, although the communists then destroy her career. So her passion to rebuild her country, but to also gain an independent Poland. She serves, she supports, she fights against martial law, she fights with solidarity. So she plays a role in that as well. So the freedom of Poland, and of course, it was solidarity that kicked the whole thing off. That's when they were the first country, and then everyone else follows. So that's afterwards we get toppling of the wall in Germany and all the rest of it. So she plays a role in that as well. So that's two massive legacies, okay? But she's also got a legacy as this example, and not the only one of many, of the women who served. And they weren't the first women. You did get women. You got the Hushwacks in the First World War. You got women, like I said, in the 1863 Polish. If you go back to medieval, you get all these women who are normally described as hangers-on, prostitutes, whatever. And a lot of them picking up arms and fighting as well. So, but she is very, well, I'm hoping, no one had ever heard of her over here, of course, and not that many people in Poland. She's very well known in her hometown. But I think it's a really important story, and I'm hoping that this is going to help change the way that we look at female contribution and take some of the romance out of it. And you know, she was courageous. Yes, a lot of these women did pay the ultimate sacrifice, and we need to respect that and honour that. But the women's contribution isn't always tragic. They're not all pretty. In fact, that could be a problem because it makes their voice more memorable. A lot of them are very plain and they're just getting on with it. They're just average people. And she, or in that regard, and the role that she plays, her story just reminds us not only courage, not only sacrifice, but also results. How really effective these women were.
From my comments, I want to finish on that, which is we, as said at the very beginning, we've had a bit of a rant on the last couple of episodes around what's going on with equality and DEI around the world. There is a risk that people think that this is somehow a liberal fairness conversation. That's interesting. You can have that conversation and that's all fine. If you want to win a war, you go find the most valuable people with the most valuable skills to beat the enemy. And I don't care whether that is men or women or whatever other people you might describe. I think Agent Zoe is the fantastic example of the best person for the job doing something incredible. The fact that she was a woman is interesting and important, but that it is about the best person to do incredible things.
Yeah, and in this book, I mean, it's a biography. It's essentially about her, right? But it's also about this group of women that she worked closely with. I mentioned some of them. Amelia Malessa running the courier route, Zofia Franio doing the sabotage groups and so on. But it's also about the men that they served alongside. So obviously Rum is a key character. There's an incredible man, Jan Novak, who was a courier who Zoe worked with, enabled him to be the first witness to get out after the Warsaw Uprising and tell the world via the BBC what was happening. She got him out. And so it's about men and women serving together. This is about, it is a story essentially about the women's because their story hasn't been told previously. Jan Novak has a fantastic, it's on my shelf, which is why I'm pointing, memoir that he wrote called Courier from Warsaw. A lot of these stories have been told, and believe me, they can be told again and probably better. You know, well, not necessarily better. A memoir is a very personal telling, but there's other ways to tell stories, especially when the files are open and all the rest of it. But I've brought all of that in, and it's around the women. But of course, they served alongside their men. This is not. This is trying to give us a picture of the very diverse human resources that ultimately it took collectively to bring victory in the war. And
Brilliantly said. Agent Zoe, the untold story of fearless World War II resistant fighter. Oh, I've got to say it again. I'll get it wrong.
Elżbieta Zawacka.
Thank you for saving me at the end. Claire, that was really tremendous. And anyone who's listened to this and thinks that sounded exciting, go read the book. It's even more exciting. And there's all the stories we skipped over, including, and I love this, we did an influencer episode around Leonard Cheshire. I don't know how much you know about Leonard Cheshire.
Yes, I do. I know him. And Sue Ryder features in the book.
Exactly. That was the point as she pops up in the book. Sue Ryder. It's Sue Ryder. And I said to Gareth, we know Sue Ryder. So fantastic crossover. Claire, I know you are very busy telling this story and other stories. I know, for example, I think you're at a number of literary festivals. Where are you likely to be in the coming weeks and months? Are there any places people can come and see you in person or hear you tell Zoe's story?
Faversham, Chipping Camden. I'm at the new Althorpe Literary Festival. I mean, I'm lots of them. Please come, Berwick, lots of them. Guernsey. I can't remember offhand. Anyhow,
No,
so
that's
all
okay.
of those.
ClaireMulley.com, I believe, if I remember rightly, and you
That's
can
the
go
best
there
way
and
to
see
do
where
it.
you are.
And can I just mention, I am absolutely thrilled because I have been shortlisted for the Military History Matters magazine book of 2025. It's not the only book by a woman on there. There's three of us, but it's the only book essentially about a woman. So it's now open to public vote. If people think it's worth it, that'd be great. And I've also been longlisted for the Women's Prize. And I don't think there's many books that get Military History Matters and the Women's Prize listings. So I am thrilled, and hopefully that shows the crossover. Finally, I don't have to be on the women's history shelf, or we can just say it's all in there.
Claire, thank you so much for joining us. Particularly, this is always the way when we reach out to guests who don't know us. And Claire took a flyer and said, I'll give up some time to come talk to these idiots. Hopefully, it was fantastic for me to get to talk to people who are as passionate about us about these kinds of topics. And thank you for writing a brilliant book and telling an absolutely tremendous story. I am hoping that I can buy you a beer or even a curry. I don't know what your thing is, if you make it to WWII Festival this year, where most certainly myself and I think Gareth will try to be at. So thank you for that. Thank you for listening to this episode of Battling with Business Influencers. The usual end of podcast spiel. Please subscribe if you are new and you have not heard this before. If you want to tell us other people perhaps we should be thinking about as influencers, let us know on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. Tell your friends. I hope this was a really interesting and exciting story for you. And actually, even though we focused a lot on the story, I think along the way are all these breadcrumbs of what it means for people to be great leaders, to be great managers. And hopefully you learned something today. But for the moment, thank you for joining us on Battling with Business. We'll be back next week, hopefully with Gareth. He's disappeared off some undisclosed location somewhere. But thank you otherwise very much for joining us. And again, Claire, thank you for coming on the podcast today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on. Thank you.